Huang is a G.I.T, a geologist in training for Alberta's #1 Terrapin Signature Geothermal Energy Project. She holds a BSc Honors in Geology from UBC and an MSc in Geology specializing in geothermal energy from the University of Iceland. For the past year and a half, Katie has provided Alberta #1 with geoscience analysis of wellbore data from the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. And so Katie is going to be presenting to us today. Her talk is going to be about 45 minutes. And then at the end, if there's any questions or comments, please feel free to type them in the chat or the Q&A section. And we will be having a bit of a question and answer or discussion at the end. So with that being said, I'll hand things over to Katie. Thanks.
Okay, can you see my screen? Okay,
Yes.
Great. Thanks everyone for coming. I wasn't nervous until I saw my friend's mom watching, so now the pressure is on. Yeah, as Sarah mentioned, my name is Katie Huang. I'm a geologist in training based out of Calgary. I've been working on the Alberta #1 project since 2019. So just being part of a small team, I've had the privilege of working on a number of different parts of the project outside of geology. So it's been a really great learning experience. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of what I've learned with you today, and hopefully gain some interest with some people, and maybe we have future geothermal geologists in the audience today. So for my talk, I'm just going to start with a brief overview of geothermal energy for those who missed Kathy's talk a couple weeks ago, or just a refresher. I'll go into the geothermal resource assessment that we undertook in order to pick out an area for our project. Then I'll go into the location that we decided on and talk about the geology there and the temperature that we're expecting in our target formations. And then I'll finish off talking about the deliverables of our project. This picture on the right is just an oil and gas wellhead near our area. For our project, we are using existing oil and gas infrastructure. So we're not using the wellhead or the wellbore, but we'll be using things like the well pad and the existing roads. So for this background, I'm just gonna keep it pretty simple about geothermal energy. So some of the reasons why we are pursuing a geothermal energy project in Canada. One of the main reasons is that geothermal is a great addition to the current renewable energy mix. So energy sources such as wind and solar are great sources. However, those are both intermittent, and geothermal has the benefit of being baseload. So it runs 24/7 and 365 days, except for a couple of days for maintenance. Geothermal projects have high upfront costs because you're drilling wide bore wells that are going fairly deep, deeper than the average oil and gas well. As such, these have to be really well managed. That if the wells are managed well and the reservoirs as well, the project can last for decades. Geothermal is a renewable energy source. It uses the heat of the earth. It has a smaller footprint relative to other renewables. So surface footprint would mainly just be the wellheads, the power plant, and the associated pipelines. Normally when people think of geothermal energy, what comes to mind are the countries kind of along the Ring of Fire in volcanic and subduction zones. In these areas, you have really high temperatures at fairly shallow depths. So power generation from geothermal is a no-brainer there. In Canada and Alberta especially, where we're not in a volcanic system, we can develop power from geothermal with the right exploration. However, there is a lot of potential for direct heat use since our temperatures are likely going to be a bit lower. They can get up to 120, but for economic projects, you can look at temperatures 40 to 100 degrees Celsius. Finally, Canada is a very cold country, and we have a lot of opportunities to provide thermal heat to offset a lot of fossil fuel powered heating. So geothermal energy is the heat of the earth. The heat comes from two sources. Approximately 50% is primordial heat left over from formation of the earth, and the other 50% is from decay of radioactive isotopes. So the earth is constantly generating heat from that decay. The heat is stored in both rocks and the fluid is held in fractures and pores. In a conventional geothermal system like Alberta No. 1, we're pulling up the fluid for that heat. So we're looking for formations that are highly permeable and high porosity to hold lots of water. For other technologies such as the Everloop, which you may have heard of, they're pulling the heat directly from the rocks through convection. So this schematic here is just simplified. For a conventional system, you're just drilling straight into that reservoir and pulling the water up. A bit more specific, so this is a pretty simplified schematic that it kind of gives you a general idea of what we're doing with conventional geothermal. So as I mentioned in the last slide, we're pulling up hot water from the reservoir right to the surface, and that water is, in our project, has two uses. So the first one is it is going through an organic Rankine cycle, and that's actually through a secondary fluid. So the actual brine doesn't go through the turbine itself. So after it goes through the organic Rankine cycle, electricity is created, it goes to the transmission. And then after that thermal energy is extracted, it still has heat. So it goes through a heat exchanger and supplies heat use depending on the temperature and the fluid flow and what your heat off-takers are. In this example, it's going through a district heating system. Once the usable thermal energy is extracted, the cool brine is re-injected back to the subsurface. This is, as I mentioned, very simplified, but in practice, it's a lot more complicated because the balance of re-injection and production is very important to maintain reservoir pressure and for reservoir management for longevity of the project. This schematic just kind of gives you an idea of just how much fluid we're pulling up. So for our Alberta No. 1 project, we're planning 300 liters per second. That's for 3 production wells, so 100 liters per second each. In 24 hours, that is enough brine to fill over 10 Olympic-sized swimming pools. In comparison, this is just a typical oil well, so the fluid, both oil and water, will be, in 24 hours, fill about a third of a swimming pool. So from this image, you can kind of get an idea of just how much thermal energy is stored in all of this water, and also just shows you how much water we need to kind of deal with. So in terms of pumping it to the surface, running it through a turbine and heat exchanger and re-injecting, it really is a ton of water. So well, I'll start by explaining why we need to bring up this much water. So fluid flow is actually a very important parameter when it comes to electricity production. So this graph just shows the generation capacity in kilowatts versus the estimated flow rate for varying temperatures. And these temperatures are all realistic from what we're going to be pulling up in our project. So from 110 to 123. So as you can see, the flow rate makes a huge difference with the generation capacity here. Because we're going to be pulling up so much water, our well design has to be different. So for a typical oil and gas completion, we're looking at about 4.5 inches. For geothermal, somewhere between 9 5/8 to 13 3/8 inches. These well bores also need to accommodate large electric submersible pumps in order to bring up that large amount of fluid. So just a note on the geology, I'm sure many of you know a lot about the sedimentary basin, but we will be drilling through the typical shales, carbonates, and sandstones. Because of the extensive hydrocarbon exploration, of course, we have a really good idea on what the subsurface looks like. However, in our area in particular, Most of the wells aren't drilling to the depths that we're targeting, so we have limited information on the properties of our target formations. Another aspect about oil and gas data is we have temperatures from oil and gas exploration. However, those temperatures just give us a rough estimate. In geothermal, we would use more precise and longer temperature logs. Another note I want to bring up on here is given that Alberta's average thermal gradient is somewhere between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius per kilometer, and we need to bringing up 120 degrees Celsius fluid for power production, we need to be targeting formations that are about 4 kilometers or deeper. So where we have the basement shallower than that, so pretty much anywhere like the east half of Alberta, with the exception of some anomalies, it's likely not going to have power production here. And the reason for that is because we don't think that the Precambrian basement is going to be a geothermal target based on the permeability and lack of fluid flow. And so we're going to be targeting these formations just sitting on top of the Precambrian basement. So this map here is just showing the extent of warm sedimentary basin. And the purpose of this map is just to kind of show you that we really are looking at a lower grade temperature resource. If these are mapped hot springs in Western Canada, as you can see, none of them really go into the sedimentary basin. They kind of stop, I would say, at the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench. So these thermal hot springs are indicative of subsurface convection, their surface manifestations. So if we're not seeing these, it's likely that we don't have that subsurface convection deep into our formations. We're looking at aquifers at moderate temperatures in Paleozoic carbonates, just because we're expecting those to have that high permeability that we need. And we're also targeting thick sequences of lower thermal conductivity sedimentary rocks. So it's lower grade temperature, so it is a bit harder than a classic geothermal system to create power, but we're hoping to do it as well as provide direct heat use. And just a summary of our project. So in 2019, Natural Resources Canada announced that they would provide $25.4 million of funding through their Emerging Renewable Power Program. As part of that grant, we have to produce 5 megawatts net of electric power. In order to do that, at our expected temperatures of 120 degrees Celsius, we need 300 liters per second. We're also planning for direct heat use, and the size of that direct heat use is dependent on basically how big we can scale our project. We are estimating to drill 5 large bore wells, 3 production and 2 injection. The proponent of the project is Alberta No. 1 Limited Partnership, and it's managed by Terrapin Geothermics. So before we began, we took a look at the whole province of Alberta and tried to pinpoint a few locations that would be the most feasible for geothermal development. So the criteria for that is that we need a temperature gradient high enough so that our fluids will be about 120 Celsius at depths of less than 4,000 meters. Anything deeper than that, the wells are going to be too costly. We need formations at the depths with high permeability, high fluid flow, so either thick formations or multiple formations, and we need to be near adequate existing infrastructure for power and direct heat use. So we chose 9 study areas, and the way we chose these study areas is we focused on communities that were already interested in pursuing geothermal projects. It's a lot easier to get the project going if the community is invested. We looked at areas where we knew from drillers and from people in oil and gas to have high water cuts with really hot fluids at the surface, and areas that had high heat flow and thermal gradients from past literature. So these are the 9 study areas. and Alberta No. 1 near Grand Prairie is where we ended up. This is just an example of the literature review. These are maps from Wise and Majorowicz. So we have heat flow on the left and geothermal gradient on the right. These maps kind of gave us a good starting point as to where the hotspots were. As you can see, we have high heat flow and gradients in the northwest of Alberta, but in that area, we don't really have the heat off-takers in the communities. On the other hand, in the areas with high population densities, such as Calgary, you can see that there's lower heat flow and thermal gradients. So we're kind of looked at some of these areas in between. An important thing to note is that this is a regional study, so it gives an approximation, but we wanted to look into these areas to look more in depth and do more local studies. So to assess the temperature, we kept it pretty simple, and we used the hundreds of thousands of oil and gas well data that exists, and we used GeoScout for that. So to calculate the gradient with each area, we just used this simple equation, bottom hole temperature that was reported in GeoScout minus surface temperature, which was about 0.6 degrees Celsius, divided by total vertical depth times 1,000. So this kind of gave us a rough estimate of what gradient within each study area would be. There's been a lot of past research looking at how we can use these oil and gas data, the problems with them, and how we need to filter them. A lot of these measurements are inaccurate and not well reported, so a lot of filtering needs to be done. Once you filter that, a correction still needs to be applied. We believe, or research has suggested, that bottom hole temperatures from oil and gas data are reported about 10% lower than the actual formation temperature. And this is simply because you have the drilling fluids circulating, which cool the well, and then the bottom hole temperature is taken. However, from the database, we don't know at what time the bottom hole temperature was taken, if the well has had time to equilibrate. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty there. This graph here just shows bottom hole temperatures compared to drill stem tests and pressure tests. And as you can see, bottom hole temperatures are reported quite a bit lower than these tests, which are thought to be more accurate. The reason that we didn't apply a correction method, number one, is that we didn't really have a method to apply. Some methods use the time taken from circulating the drilling fluid. We don't have that. We just have a single point. And the other reason is that we just used it as kind of the lower estimate from what our gradients would be, and that we could compare each gradient from each study area relative to one another. So these are the results. The blue is the bottom hole temperature, and the orange is the gradient for each study area. So as you can see, the gradient is pretty linear with depth. However, there's a lot of scatter, so it's not possible to see if there are any smaller trends. And as well, the gradient appears to not change significantly with depth for some of the areas, although in some you can see that it does decrease a little bit with depth. In some of the study areas, we just didn't really have a lot of data, so we weren't that confident in the gradient. Overall, the Grand Prairie area gave us an average thermal gradient of 25.8 Celsius per kilometer. And that's, again, the lower estimate, so we actually expect it to be a little bit higher. From this graph, you can see that it's not the highest gradient. It's about somewhere in the middle between all the areas. However, Grand Prairie area checks the other boxes for having the community interested, as well as existing infrastructure and potential heat off-takers. So that's why we chose that area. So once we decided the general area, we began to look into exactly where we should put our project. So far, we've decided on these 3 sites. So this is kind of our project area. This yellow part here is the County of Grand Prairie, and you can see the 3 sites are in the municipal district of Greenview, just south of the city of Grand Prairie, and all along Highway 40, which is the major highway. These sites are all existing oil and gas well pads. So for these two sites, this one we've called the Wapiti site, this one here we've called the Grovedale site. The advantage of these two is that they're close to power corridor. So this red line here shows the power line. They're close to existing pipeline infrastructure. For those who are familiar with the area, there's a lot of previously drilled wells. It's also close to these heat off-takers. Well, I'll talk in the next slide, but we have this light industrial park here that's in planning stage, and the Norbord plant here. This site, which we've called Gold Creek site, south, it also has the advantages of being close to the power corridor and near existing pipeline infrastructure. It's also adjacent to this railway here on the gray dotted line. And it sits within this Greenview Industrial Gateway, which is an industrial park in the planning phases, and it will have several industrial heat off-takers. So for these first two sites, I'll just talk about the potential heat off-takers. Right now, we're in discussions with the Norbord-oriented Strand Board plant as to how their facility might benefit from our geothermal heat resources. Their facility uses hot water at various processes. For example, they have outdoor log ponds that are heated year-round. This light industrial park next to this hamlet of Grovedale is in planning stages. The benefit of having a heat off-taker in the planning stages is that you can develop, for example, a district heating system in conjunction with the project, so you don't have to redo that infrastructure. Another reason that we like this area is that it had the potential for upsizing. As you can see, the dots here are showing the drilled wells, and so we're in discussion with lease owners to take over existing well pads, and we're also looking into permitting new well pads to accommodate an expanded project in terms of both megawatt power and thermal energy produced. Because our project size is really only limited by the amount of fluid we can bring up, we wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to expand. So I'll get into the geology of our area. So this map here is just showing all the drilled wells in the area. As you can see, there are a lot of them. However, most of these wells don't drill past or too far past the hydrocarbon-bearing Duvernay and Montney formations. So we didn't have a lot of subsurface information for our target formations in this area. We kind of had to expand our study area a bit to get that information. Our target formations, as I mentioned, need high temperatures and high permeabilities and a bigger degree of thickness. So we're looking at the deep sandstones and limestones that are sitting right on top of the Precambrian basement to get as deep as possible. Specifically, we're targeting Devonian strata, looking at the Beaver Hill Lake group and the underlying Philwood member, granite wash, as well as these carbonate units. Some of these shale units we are expecting to be a thermal blanket, such as the Watt Mountain Shale. For a well, we are planning to set the intermediate casing at about 2,400 meters, so that's just above this log. The production casing is going to be set at the base of the Cooking Lake Formation, which is just above the Beaver Hill Lake group here. And TD is going to be at about 4,000 meters, so it's just going to go a little bit into the Precambrian basement. I should mention this is a log just generally of the Northwest Plains of Alberta, so we're not going to see exactly the stratigraphy, but this kind of gives us just a general idea. So we looked at core to try to get an idea of the physical properties of the formations. As I mentioned, there are not a lot of wells in the area drilling into those formations. These are the few that we looked at, but for the most part, we really had to expand into further out of Alberta. So these are all of the cores that we looked at. So here's some core of the Want Mountain Shale. And I should add, I'm not a sedimentary geologist, but luckily this was pretty basic, just a dark shale here below the Swan Hills and Beaver Hill Lake formations. As I mentioned, we're thinking it could act as a thermal blanket. Underlying that will be the Gilwood sandstone, which is a variable member. Here the Gilwood member is porous, coarse-grained, angular, and quartz-rich, poorly sorted sandstone. So has good potential for holding that geothermal brine. This picture is just showing the contact between the Want Mountain Shale and the Gilwood sandstone. This core is the granite wash sandstone, and we are expecting this to be the lowermost formation, although as you can see from the lithology log, it can extend upwards. Here we have some light gray shale with small feldspar grain. You can see that this well here drilled through a small fault zone, which is really good for us. That's a high permeability pathway. So we see the core breakup and some slick and slides here. Unfortunately, we didn't get any core of the dolomite and carbonate units, which are our main targets, but we are expecting them to be more permeable and more porous than these sandstones. And then kind of just for fun, looking at the Precambrian basement, even though it's not a target, but it is just a scientific interest. We found that the basement varied a lot depending on location and depth. So this picture here is one core, and these three are all from the same core. So from this one, you can see it's a low porosity granite with dark gray matrix with some feldspar grains here. This one had some hydrothermal alteration, as we can see from clays, chlorite, and biotite, so possibly a fault zone here. This picture was actually just 2 meters below this one. As you can see, it's nice with these large K-felds, phenocrysts, and then this one is 1 or 2 meters below that, and it's just a black and white gneiss with distinct foliation. So, I mean, if you're drilling into a possible fault, you might have some potential for geothermal production, but overall, you're getting really low permeability gneiss into the Precambrian. So after we had figured that kind of the lower estimate of our gradient is about 25, 26 degrees Celsius per kilometer, we wanted to get a true geothermal temperature log from surface to TD. So we had the fortune of using a secure energy well. So they drilled this disposal well in 2018. It's cased and perforated, but it has never been used. This well is perfect for our purposes because the well has had sufficient time to equilibrate and heat back up. So we ran the log at a constant speed, recording temperature both going up and down, and taking 30 to 60 minute stops at the top and bottom. For the temperature log, so this is actually the gradient versus depth. The depth was just past 4,000 meters. All of these lines are moving average, varying from 10 meters to 1,000 meters. So this big red line is the 1,000 meter moving average. So a bit of a better idea of generally what's going on. The reason that this temperature profile is better for our purposes than a single BHT depth is that we get a continuous profile from surface to TD. If we're looking at temperature versus depth, we can see if there are any spikes. Those are possible inflow zones, which is indicative of a good formation for our purposes. We can also correlate the temperature and the heat flow to lithology. So that's what we did here with the temperature log next to lithology log. When Secure drilled the well, they did rock description. So I just generalized that and put it into a log. The max temperature recorded was 118 degrees Celsius. That was really good news for us because on the well ticket on GeoScout, the BHT was recorded at 108 degrees Celsius. So we were really excited to see that because it told us, well, that's just one data point for us to kind of agree that the BHT is lower than the actual temperature, and it actually falls pretty closely within that 10% range of how BHT compares to actual formation temperature. The average gradient of the whole log was 28.7 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So again, higher than what we calculated from the BHTs. However, as you can see here, we have a significant change in gradient. So for the upper portion of the well, up to about 2,800 meters, the gradient is 31.6 Celsius per kilometer. And then at this inflection point, you can see that the gradient reduces drastically to 21.1 degrees Celsius per kilometer. We propose that this inflection point is related to stratigraphy, and we see this in a lot of other sedimentary basin where they've taken geothermal temperature logs. As you can see from the lithology, this upper portion is dominated by shales and sandstones. At the inflection point, it's the Charlie Lake Formation here. And besides a few siltstone formations, we can see that the majority of the formations are limestone and dolomites. So this correlates really well. It makes a lot of sense in terms of a physical rock property point of view, just because of the change in the heat flow values from sandstones and shales to carbonate units. So what this means for our project and for future exploration is that if you have the lithology, you can get a pretty good idea of how the gradient is going to change with depth. For example, say you just had a well that was drilled into sandstones, you're going to probably get a pretty high thermal gradient. However, you don't want to project that all the way to your TD. You need to account for the change in gradient with lithology. Overall, though, the temperature really confirmed that we have the geothermal resource to produce the power that we need and produce the water for direct heat use. So I'll just talk a bit about the deliverables of our project, what we're expecting to provide. And I'll start with the heat portion here. So the importance of heat, and this is something that we've really been trying to stress both as Alberta No. 1 and through Geothermal Canada, our association, is that heat is has huge benefits for Calgary or for Canada, given its cold climate. These graphs here are from Enercan's Energy Fact Book. So just showing residential appliance energy use, and you can see that space heating takes up a huge amount, 62% of that, and then water heating is additional 19%. On the commercial side of things, it's a little bit less, but we still have 15% of energy used for space heating and an additional 6% for water heating. So just right there, you can really see how much potential there is for fossil fuel offsets for heating uses. Another important aspect is the temperature difference. So in the winter, when we're at -20, -30, that temperature difference with even 60 or 80 degrees Celsius brine is going to make that thermal energy that much more valuable. Another thing we want to focus on is not only offsetting fossil fuel heating for existing infrastructure, but also creating new opportunities. So this is just an example of all the different industries that direct heat use can benefit. So on the tourism side, we can start our water at right after you take out the thermal energy for power production. Your water is still hot enough for community space and water heating, and then for heating on a smaller scale. And then even when your waters are 40 Celsius and below, you have the opportunities for things such as pools. So for those who have been to Iceland, you know how much of an attraction that can be. On the agricultural side, we can use the heat from anywhere to greenhouses, fish farms, and crop drying. And you can see here that there really is a lot of potential for Alberta there. And then on the industry side, and this is more related to how Alberta number 1 is going to start off with our direct heat use, pulp and paper, and then kind of on the lower temperature scale, we have timber, and then even the possibility for distillery and brewery. Overall, our project will provide 300 terajoules a year of clean baseload heat. So that's enough to provide domestic hot water and central heating to more than 6 million square feet of domestic and commercial buildings. Just to put that in perspective, that's about 10 acres of greenhouses. So really, really positive implications for food security, especially in the north. The project, if we can scale it up to 10 megawatts electric, that's enough to power about 2,500 homes. And then kind of on the emissions offset side, sorry, my dog is eating something. So we have 2 emission offset projects to be developed, and this is because the opportunity for greenhouse gas credits, because how low emission geothermal energy is. So one of these projects is for heating and one is for power generation. That's under the current Alberta offset protocols. These offsets are generated at a value of 13.3% discount to the federal carbon price, which is currently $50 per tons of CO2 equivalent, as well as potential for these projects to be carbon negative, so we can support carbon reduction in other industries. So you can see here there's a lot of potential for geothermal to combine with other energy producers in other industries. We also have 2 MOUs signed with heat off-taker clients here. So this is just kind of the start of how our one project plans to make a difference. It's important to note that our Alberta number 1 project is, although it is planned to be producing electricity and heat, it also is, our first well is going to be exploratory in nature. So we still have a lot of room to prove the resource, gain investor confidence, and show Albertans and Canadians the potential for geothermal and connections with other industries. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thanks very much. Happy to answer any questions, but if you want to take it offline, please feel free to email me. My email's right here. And also for anybody who's interested in becoming more involved in the geothermal industry, I encourage you to check out Geothermal Canada and also look into becoming a member. Individual memberships are $40 a year, student and retired members are $20, and corporate memberships $150. For individual members, you become a member of the International Geothermal Association, as well as get updates. Student members, we're planning to have some student grants for research and conferences in the near future. And for corporate members, we can put your logo up on our page, and also happy to share any news that you might have with our members and on our page. No, that's it. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. That was really great presentation overall. I was just reviewing the question and answer section here, and I see that there were some questions that were asked during the presentation, and that Kathy, so for those who weren't online when I introduced the topic, Dr. Catherine Hickson, she did the part 1 presentation on this subject matter. She has written out some excellent answers to some of the questions already. If it's of interest, we can maybe read out some of these questions, and Katie or Kathy, if you'd like, are welcome to sort of answer them using audio as well. And then that's great because that'll be also in the recording for people who want to watch this video back at another time. So if that's all right, I'll just start with the first question and go through them, and we'll go through as many as we can. And feel free to keep asking your questions. Like Katie said, we've got some, we'd love to have some discussion around some of this. So the first question is, how do you manage formation pressure during injection and re-injection? What tools are you using for monitoring?
So, Sarah, do you want to let me put my video on?
Yes, I assume I have to go in to do that, don't I? See if I can do that for you. Invite. Oh, yeah, you should be.
Well, anyway, that's that's fine.
Sorry, I'm not sure how to turn the camera on for you.
Yeah, I just have to permit my video. Anyway, hi everybody, and delighted. That was a great talk, Katie, and a great segue from my talk, which was a little bit more arm wavy and more about the industry in general. So the fact that we've got 30 plus of you back today is excellent. So in terms of the pressure, I mean, we use basically the same town hall tools as you do in the oil and gas industry. We do things a little bit different. For example, when Katie was talking about this logging that we just did for the temperature, we log both down the hole very slowly. We sit on the bottom for half an hour to 30 minutes, and then we log slowly back up the well. With the pressure, we put down pressure transducers. We will monitor the pressure is such an important part of the reservoir management that pressure is basically continuously monitored in the field when it's producing. There was another question a little bit further about, it was again about the reservoir and how we actually do some of the testing in the reservoir. So once we've drilled a doublet, so we've got a producer and an injector, then what we'll do is we test between those two wells. We test by injection. So we do pressure testing, we do injection testing, and then we also do tracer testing. And that is how we get a better understanding of what that resource looks like, how connected it is. And of course, our main goal is to maintain the pressure so that we can have a sustainable system, as well as to, so we want to maintain the pressure and we don't want to cool our system. So those are critical parameters that we're constantly monitoring to make sure that we're keeping our reservoir, well, we're not draining it down so fast that we are cooling it and we're losing pressure. So do we want to go on to the next one?
Sure, yeah, and my apologies, I still am trying to get your camera to come on, but I'm not seeing an option for switching it over. So I guess we can just continue
Yeah, that's fine.
anybody...
Yeah, the message I get is because the host has stopped it. So there must be some magic button for you.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't find it right in this moment, so apologies.
No problem.
It wasn't my intention to stop you. Okay, so so the next question then was asking about the production rate of 300 liters per second. Do you have any considerations or analysis if this rate will be suitable to delay the thermal breakthrough?
Yeah, so that's basically what the second part of the question that I answered. And so we monitor that, we monitor temperature, we monitor pressure, we do tracer testing in order to ensure that we don't get thermal breakthrough.
Excellent. The next question, hi Katie, any deposition of temperature indicator minerals that you find in the cores showing existence of interaction hydrothermal fluid with the host rock?
Yeah, so in one of those cores we had some clays, nothing super high, and again we didn't get the core from most of our target formations, like some of the carbonate target formations, so we don't really have an idea of that. If anything, I think those minerals would give a much higher temperature, showing more the fluid history. So it wouldn't really be indicative of, for our purposes, of what the temperatures are now, especially at our lower 100 to 120 degrees Celsius.
Great. The next question. Is it possible there's critical minerals such as lithium in the brine, and is possibly co-production geothermal energy and lithium from the same system?
I'll let Kathy answer that, because she touched on that in her presentation a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, so we know that the oil field brines in Alberta do have lithium concentrations, pretty low. The highest that I've seen from Alberta is about 150 milligrams per liter. So it's a challenge to commercially extract lithium at those low levels. But the idea, and there's MGX and E3 and several other companies that are looking to do this. So what geothermal can do is facilitate that. We have to drill those wells. We have to pump that brine to the surface. Once we've extracted the heat, either for power and or thermal energy, then we could put it through some kind of a separator and extract the lithium and then inject it back down into the subsurface. So we will certainly be designing our system so that if there is lithium that is commercially extractable, we'll be able to do that. But we probably won't. What we'd be looking for is basically to partner with, with a company that has, well, for one thing, that they have the metallic mineral rights, but also that they will pay for the extraction. It's not part of our budget.
Great. And then I've just moved over to the other section of the question and answer that I hadn't seen. So these we can answer live. The first is just saying, this is such an exciting technology and so great to see you being an early explorer, Katie. Faults within a reservoir can help with permeability. However, how important is it to understand if a reservoir is fractured or could be connected by faults with other adjacent formations, such as like a containment issue?
So for this question, I'm not sure if by containment you mean containment for colder brine going into the lower formations. I think this is something that we would be able to understand with flow tests. So if there was containment, we would be able to kind of see that if it were to equilibrate over time and get that temperature through our longer term testing. Do you have anything to add on that, Kathy?
Yeah, there's basically two kinds of reservoirs. So there is the fracture or fault hosted ones, which are associated with volcanic systems, are more often associated with volcanic systems. And then we have our sedimentary reservoirs. So we're actually expecting most of our brine to be produced from, transmissivity, the interpore spaces that are related to the original either deposition or, in the case of dolomitization, so secondary porosity rather than porosity that is related to faulting. Certainly, as Katie pointed out, that faults that we could see in the basement is of interest. And in our temperature logging, that's one of the things that we look for is there any breakthrough from fractures that may be carrying fluids that are hotter or colder than what we're trying to produce? So we're certainly interested in faults, but we think in terms of the production of this reservoir and this particular location, it is going to be more the either primary or secondary porosity of the sediments.
And then there's somewhat of a follow-up question from another attendee asking if there's any consideration given to hydraulic fracturing a formation that may have an ideal temperature but less ideal permeability.
That's a good one. I'll take that one, Katie. So, because we've thought about that a lot, and in geothermal, philosophically, we don't fracture, and this is because if you think about those flow rates, so what Katie said is that a typical oil and gas well, you may be flowing 10 liters per second. We need to flow, so from a single well, we need to flow at least 100 liters per second. So in fracturing, so if we're saying, let's take our 10 liter per second well, if we were to fracture that, maybe we could double our flow rate. What's that going to get us? 20 liters per second. That isn't going to get us commercial. So for geothermal, fracturing is usually not cost effective. And if we have a tight well, what we'll do, one of the most effective ways to, in fact, promote fracture is cold water injection. So we will cold water inject over a period of a year, sometimes 2 years, to see if we can improve the injectivity or the production of that well. But fracturing is just because we just can't get the kind of fracture porosity that we require out of a well. So basically, no, we would have to be incredibly desperate and to actually want to fracture a well.
Great. And then just a follow up on the earlier question. By containment, they're asking, I mean, the risk of not having a closed system, such as loss of pressure and loss of fluid, would you consider using seismic to help understand the physical characteristics of the reservoir?
So I'll jump in there, Katie, or do you want to answer that one?
Sorry, I'm just typing an answer for another one.
Okay, so absolutely. I mean, we will use all the geophysical techniques that are possible and cost effective for us to understand the deep reservoir. So the short answer is yes. In geothermal fields, there's a lot more downhole seismicity that is being tested to look for microseismicity. So yes, we would use whatever is available out there.
Great. I saw another question over in the chat. Slightly different focus. So the question is, during the last webinar, you mentioned that 110 degrees Celsius can provide electricity and yield 10 megawatts gross. Can you explain the turbine efficiency and exhaust temperature used in the calculation?
Yeah, so what you have to remember is harken back to Katie's slide with the graph, and that graph that showed you megawatts versus temperature and flow rates. So in that graph, what you'll see is that at 110 degrees C, we have to flow in order to make essentially 10 megawatts, we have to flow 300 liters per second. So that is the key. The efficiency of an ORC unit is about 20-25%, something in there. And that's not exactly regardless of the temperature, but around in that 100 to 120 degrees C temperature, that's what the efficiency is. So the fact that we can make 10 megawatts at 110 degrees is more about the volume of flow than anything else.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy, for that. Another question here is, have you considered how basin modeling can help predict present day temperatures in areas where you have limited data and use other temperature indicators like RO to calibrate the model? And then, of course, nothing beats the temperature log measurements, just thinking as part of the screening process.
Yeah, Katie, that's your question. That's what she's been spending her life doing for the last many months.
Yeah, I mean, where we have limited data, it is hard to figure out what the subsurface temperature is going to look like on a local scale. For example, so some of those maps that I showed, we do have a good idea of regionally what is happening in the subsurface. But in terms of, we are only limited by how much data we have. And also the quality of the data. So this temperature log is something that we hope to have, do in other wells across Alberta in order to kind of help understand how the oil and gas data is related to the actual formation temperatures, so we can get a better idea or more accurate model. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and just to add there, I mean, there are people like Dr. Jacek Majorowicz, U of A. I mean, he has spent his career working on that aspect. There's another professor, Dr. Will Grosnold, University of North Dakota, who has spent his career. David Blackwell down in the States also. So many people trying to understand the relationship between basically the oil and gas measurements and what is really happening in the subsurface is those are careers.
So we're just at 5 o'clock now. We can keep this conversation going for a little bit, but I thought I did see a question that Katie, I believe, may have actually responded to in text, but I thought I'd read it out loud anyways, because I think it's a good way to sort of wrap up at the end of this. If I can find it. Given the low temperature gradient close to Calgary, does this mean a low possibility of leveraging this energy in the city?
Yeah, so my response was that close to Calgary, I mean, we could benefit from doing another temperature log in a well closer to the city. But ultimately, it's only going to give us a temperature a few degrees higher than what the oil and gas temperature is going to tell us, which is telling us that the gradient is quite low. So, what I mentioned in the response was with the current technology, we probably are not going to be able to economically produce power. Technically, it could be feasible. For example, in Alaska, they have managed to generate power from 70 degrees Celsius brine. I could go into a whole other spiel about the economics of it. Producing that amount of power is just not comparable to natural gas. So that's where the important direct heat use comes in. Personally, I think that, maybe not right next to Calgary, but within driving distance, we have the potential to have some direct heat use projects. Remember that Calgary is close to a lot of thermal hot springs that are within the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench, so indicative of convective sources, so higher temperature geothermal resources there. And the last thing I mentioned is that unfortunately, a lot of these hot springs being in the Southern Rocky Mountain Trench are within national parks, so limitations with development there.
So could I just add, just to emphasize, the really important aspect for the Calgary area is direct use. It's that thermal energy. It's not power. And we can make these projects commercial by adding things like CO2 sequestration, as well as, that lithium brine extraction. So even though we may not be able to produce power, there's huge value in that thermal energy, as well as those fluids being brought to the surface. And remember that we can use down to 40 degrees C is useful. In a climate like what we have in Alberta and Calgary, 40 degrees C is pretty darn hot and can be used effectively.
Absolutely. That's a very good thing to remember. in all of this. So I think with that, we're going to wrap up here. If you're interested as an attendee, there are some more questions that have been answered with text in the question and answer under the answered tab. So feel free to check those out. But I think we've covered the majority of them. So I just want to say thank you so much to Catherine and Katie for volunteering to present in our first two presentations here with this new speaker series. They were very generous to spend their time putting this together and presenting for us today and 2 weeks ago. So thank you so much to both of you. We do really appreciate it. And then we have another talk coming up in a week presented by Matt Hall, and that will be more on more with the focus of data science. It's titled Getting More Quantitative, Choose Your Own Adventure, or that's the working title as far as we're working with now. So that's on April 7th at 10 a.m. If possible, Andrew, could you share that slide again for everybody so they can see the notes for it? And then, yeah, if you're interested, please email epp@gmail.com and we will get you all the Zoom link info. And also, if you're interested, you can check out in the chat. There's a link provided there. And thank you everyone for coming and for all the great questions and conversation. And we'll let you head out with the rest of your day now.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sarah, for hosting.
Likewise,
My pleasure.
thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks.